think I will basically complement what Kenan Malik just started. And if I may basically start with the word consequences. It's the consequences that matter. The consequences on women's and children's daily lives. If you are going to make an argument, a theory, an intellectual argument, you better also consider the consequences of what you're saying. And this is the core message of my book, Women and Sharia Law, The Impact of Legal Pluralism in the UK. The catalyst for writing the book was an article by a colleague, a professor in social anthropology, in the December 2008 bulletin of the Swiss Federal Commission Against Racism. In it, he suggested that Switzerland should introduce a soft legal pluralism. And that means allowing some groups from different culture or religious backgrounds to resort to their own laws in specific areas of jurisprudence. He argued in an interview thereafter that the presence of migrants from very remote cultural circles demands this legal shift. He said, and I'm quoting him, "The cultural distance is too great. And however much these migrants assimilate, there always remains a difference, also to our legal system." He then proposed the introduction of Sharia and other religious courts which would deal specifically with civil matters, but then he added also with offenses and assaults. Of course, human rights should be fully maintained in a Swiss Sharia court, according to him. We're here talking about group rights, identity politics, but group rights. Now, from my perspective, I'm a female academic researcher, research gender situation in many Arab and Middle Eastern countries. And I'm also a women's rights advocate, human rights advocate, and was and still is involved in various campaigns for gender justice, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. So, as a woman also who experienced firsthand the consequences of application of Islamic law, somehow I knew all too well what the professor's suggestion would entail. So the next week, the same Sunday newspaper that interviewed him published an opinion article and my response to his suggestion with the title, "Islamic Law in Switzerland Would Be Devastating." Now, it was this debate that led me to research the topic further and to write the book about it. Because at conferences and in literature, Britain has always been used as a good example for this model of soft legal pluralism, I thought it's worth investigating. So I visited Islamic Sharia tribunals, Muslim arbitration tribunals in various British cities, and met leading sheikhs, including the only woman on their panels. She's not a judge, but nevertheless, she's in the panel. And I also interviewed experts and lawyers, activists in civil society and women's rights groups, especially from within the Muslim communities, in addition to politicians who were arguing and pleading for a reform of this system. The more I researched the subject, the more I read, the more I talked with people, the more I realized that our Swiss professor's suggestion is just the tip of an iceberg. I mean, he's not alone. He's actually expressing a certain kind of ideological paradigm. It's an expression of a paradigm of thinking, one that has dominated the postmodern, post-colonial discourses for far too long. I call it the Essentialist Paradigm. 4 features characterize this paradigm. The first, it combines multiculturalism as a political process, and I think you can see yourself, Kenan Malik, in what I'm saying in this feature, because I'm taking it from you, as a political process with the policy of legal pluralism. So we're not only talking about a multicultural context where you are cherished for being what you are, regardless of your gender, color, religion, race. No, we're talking about a context where you are not looked as an individual, as a citizen, you are looked as a member of a group identity. And with that, you set them apart, placing them in parallel legal enclaves. You're putting them in cultural identity boxes. It perceives rights from a group perspective, that is, the group has the rights, not the individuals within it. And Charles Taylor is very important in this paradigm of thinking with the politics of difference. And it insists that each group has a collective identity and culture, an essential identity, which should be protected and perpetuated, even if doing so violates the rights of the individuals within this group. It is dominated by a cultural relativist approach to rights, that is to say that rights and other social practices, values, and rules are culturally determined. And finally, it's very much haunted by the white man's burden. And let me say that white man's burden, I see it very much clearly also in the discussion that I have with my students, in the discussion that I have with policymakers. White man's burden. A mindset formed by a strong sense of shame and guilt over the West's colonial and imperial past, and shaped as well by a paternalistic desire to protect minorities or people from former colonies. A mindset that perceives the other, whether a member of a minority group or an entire third world country, as the oppressed, the human rights as the tools imposed by the Western oppressors. It considers that those who are fighting for universal human rights, all human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. Those in their own societies are not being authentic representative of their own countries, and in the process ignores or justifies dire human rights violations committed in the name of group rights or cultural and religious rights. This is the essentialist paradigm. And the book Women and Sharia Law, The Impact of Legal Pluralism, is a critique of this school of thought. It is also a book about the context within which this discourse is taking place. Often, some of the academic proponents of the paradigm have become the unwitting allies of Islamists who propagate the ideology of political Islam that seeks to essentialize Islam, doesn't see Islam as diverse as it should be. No, there is one Islam and it's only their Islam, who claim to be the sole group speaking for Muslims. They insist that they be treated as a homogeneous group and assert that human rights is a Western imposition. And in the process, they violate these rights with impunity. What these Western academics seem not to notice is the totalitarian features of political Islam and its the ambition of oppressive theocratic political domination. Both types of essentialists, Islamists and academics, are arguing that Islamic law should be introduced into the Western legal system in the name of group identity in the name of multiculturalism. Okay. And while they're doing that, they bring in a good argument, I'll put it this way. They insist that it is just one instrument of conflict resolution out of many, that is voluntary, that it is that they only support it with safeguards for human rights, especially for women's rights. They argue that if a member of a religious minority does not want to be ruled by these rules or laws, all he or she has to do is to opt and leave the community. Choice is very important in this argument, choice. Absent in this argument is the actual experience of legal pluralism in non-Western countries and its negative consequences. You just have to look back in the history and look today in countries where legal pluralism is applied and tell me if these countries are actually treating their citizens as equal before the law. The answer is not. No, they're not. In the end, you end up with a pyramid, what one calls stratified citizenry, at the top of which you have one ethnic religious group. And on the end, you end also with double discrimination syndrome, something where women of different religious backgrounds very often find themselves like sandwiched between a system and their religious group and ending up being doubly discriminated within that system. This argument is also evasive when it comes to the type of Islamic law being used by this method of conflict resolution. I'm talking here about a legal dimension of my religion, Islam, legal dimension. And this legal dimension, I refrain from calling it holy. I define Sharia by the way it's being implemented in Islamic states and within Muslim family laws. I see it as a selection from the corpus of legal opinions of jurisprudence, developed over the course of Islamic history, but specifically between the 7th and 10th century. Imagine, 7th and 10th century. At that time, these rules were developed. Now you can imagine that is shaped by the social, political, historical structures of that time, by the position of women at that time. Slavery was a common institution. In the view of this classical Islamic law, a woman is part of a hierarchical social structure dominated by the man at the top, and as a legal person, the woman is controlled before her marriage by her male guardian and after marriage by her husband. The rules regarding the minimum age of marriage and the terms of guardianship make child marriages and forced marriages possible. And the rules on divorce and maintenance rights discriminate against the woman. Now, looking at Islamic law from this perspective inevitably highlights its problematic nature, because this is not about its theoretical potential to provide justice. Yes, it can be reformed. What we are in fact looking at is its actual implementation and hence its obvious limitations and how it contravenes contemporary concepts of human rights. What we are looking at is how it's being implemented, how it's being interpreted and used today, not how it might be applied in 100 years from today. The type of Sharia law implemented in British Islamic Sharia councils and tribunals contravenes this concept, the concept of gender equality and human rights. I can talk more about this if you wish, but for the moment it suffices to know that it is a type of law that considers, it's like it's a mindset, and it considers children legally eligible for marriage once they attain puberty. It gives the male guardian the power to impose a marriage on a virgin girl without her knowledge or consent if you come from certain jurisprudences, Sunni jurisprudences. If she contracts a marriage without her guardian's consent, her guardian can invalidate the marriage, and some confirmed that they did that. Some found a way not to implement that, but it is considered a legal rule that one can resort to. And it is the kind of law that considers obedience a duty of the wife, and if a wife is disobedient, she loses her right to maintenance, and her husband may beat her as a last disciplinary measure. Now, importantly, the essentialists consistently ignore the social context within which this law is being implemented. When we talk about choice, the exit possibility, we very much ignore the context. So while we're talking about consequences, let's also talk about the context within which we are talking. We are talking about close communities where both young men and women are subjected to a suffocating social control. And this makes an exit option and the freedom of choice simply unrealistic. As the report, When Legal Words Overlap, so accurately argued, the question is whether the free option is indeed real and available. An exit option requires, A, the presence of a welcoming community outside. That's not always a given. Not if you are living in what's then called the monoplural culturalism society. It presumes autonomy and access to other resources which many individuals lack, and it ignores the fact that the pressure to conform, that pressure to tradition, is usually strong and may also block exit. Ultimately, assessing the extent of individuals' free choice in such cases can be next to impossible. Lastly, the discourse about legal pluralism is for the most part unaware of the role played by political Islam in promoting Islamic law in non-Islamic society. And I've seen that in many countries and societies, and not only in the UK, but also in South Africa and in the Middle East. There is a strong political dimension that must be included in this whole discussion. And my research in Britain has revealed that this dimension is not only there, it's very clear somehow. It started when beginning in the 50s, some South Asian religious movements, Deobandi Islam, for instance, which is like a twin kind of Salafi, it's not the same, but the Salafi of the Arabian Peninsula, were working within their own communities to separate the members of their communities from the outside world and to create what they consider a supreme Islamic identity. And this in turn set the stage for a strategy promoted by supporters of political Islam. And I'm talking here about a South Asian context, so we're talking here about the Jamaat al-Islamiyah, to portray their Islamist agenda as the demands of all Muslims and Islam. And the two groups, whose members often control some of the Sharia courts, councils, and tribunals, share a similar ambition of creating an Islamic state, implementing Sharia law, arguing for the supremacy of Muslims and Islam. If we let them succeed, we will not see more integration, but rather extremism, confrontation, and ultimately social unrest. In short, the book is both a critique of the essentialist discourse and a defense of the universality of human rights and secularism. I hope that you understand by now and appreciate why I have little sympathy for those voices that call for the introduction of Islamic law in family affairs in European and North American societies. It is the consequences of such demands that one must examine to understand how dangerous They could be to the concepts of gender equality, women's and children's rights, but also, most importantly, social cohesion. Social cohesion. In fact, legal pluralism is a recipe for the legitimization of systematic discrimination against women and children. It will certainly not help with the successful integration of migrant communities. It will lead to the emergence of close, parallel societies and two types of citizens: those who enjoy the rights according to the state's constitution and laws, and migrants and minorities who do not. Thank you.